Deep Dive, Sable Offshore. Part 3. Case Studies. To see how this could play out, let's look at the historical precedents that map closest to Sable's situation: Mountain Valley, Dakota Access, Keystone XL, Colonial, and Trans Mountain. Each one shows a different path: clean legislative win, messy operational survival, total federal preemption failure, energy security leverage, or political risk so bad even the big boys walk away. Comparative case studies, lessons for Sable Offshore from past pipeline battles. Let's start with the Mountain Valley Pipeline, MVP. This is the golden ticket precedent, the best case scenario where regulatory gridlock gets smashed by direct federal intervention. But when you dig in, the mechanism was very specific and it highlights some key differences for Sable. The regulatory nightmare for MVP went through the same endless litigation loop we're seeing with Sable's pipelines. The Fourth Circuit Court of Appeals kept blocking things, vacating permits from the Fish and Wildlife Service and Bureau of Land Management over and over. Environmental groups like the Sierra Club and Appalachian Voices would sue every time a permit came through. The court would issue stays or vacate the permits, stopping construction cold. This dragged on for more than 5 years, ballooning costs from $3.5 billion to almost $7.85 billion. By 2022-23, the pipeline was over 90% physically built but legally frozen. How it got unstuck? The Fiscal Responsibility Act of 2023. The breakthrough didn't come from winning in court. It came from changing the law itself. Senator Joe Manchin used his leverage on the debt ceiling bill to slip in Section 324 of the Fiscal Responsibility Act. It explicitly ratified and approved all existing MVP permits. It stripped the Fourth Circuit of jurisdiction over future challenges and moved any constitutional questions to the D.C. Circuit. When the Fourth Circuit tried to issue stays anyway, the Supreme Court stepped in during July 2023, vacated those stays, and let construction finish. These past pipeline fights show that projects like Sable don't usually get resolved by slowly winning in court. They get resolved when something outside the normal legal process breaks the stalemate. In the Mountain Valley Pipeline case, years of lawsuits and regulatory delays didn't end because the company argued better. It ended because Congress stepped in and changed the rules. Lawmakers explicitly approved the project, took power away from the court that kept blocking it, and the Supreme Court enforced that decision. The lesson for Sable is that when a pipeline becomes economically or politically important enough, the outcome often shifts from a legal debate to a political one. Courts can delay projects for years, but they rarely have the final word once federal priorities, energy security, or legislative action come into play. The big difference for Sable: executive versus legislative power. Sable is trying to copy the MVP playbook, but with a weaker tool. MVP used an act of Congress, raw legislative override. Sable is relying on the executive branch, PHMSA reclassifying the pipeline as interstate, and President Trump's National Energy Emergency Declaration. The Supreme Court backed MVP because Congress can change laws and strip jurisdiction. Executive actions and agency decisions face Administrative Procedure Act review and are far more vulnerable to judicial reversal. Sable is chasing the same outcome with a less reliable weapon. In simple terms, Mountain Valley won because Congress changed the rules, which courts have to respect. Sable is trying to get the same result, but instead of a new law, it's relying on actions by federal agencies and the president. That approach can work, but it's shakier because courts can review and potentially overturn executive or agency decisions. So, Sable is aiming for the same endgame as Mountain Valley Federal Authority, breaking the deadlock but using a tool that's easier for judges to challenge. Next up, Dakota Access Pipeline, DAPL, the messy win precedent. If MVP is the clean victory, DAPL is the gritty survival mode example, and this looks like the path Sable is actually walking. The Standing Rock fight, the core case, was Standing Rock Sioux Tribe v. U.S. Army Corps of Engineers. It centered on whether the Corps violated NEPA by not doing a full environmental impact statement for the Lake Oahe crossing. In 2020, Judge Boasberg ruled yes, vacated the easement, and ordered the pipeline shut down and emptied. The key appellate ruling, vacatur without shutdown energy transfer, appealed to the D.C. Circuit. And that's where the critical precedent emerged. 1. The court affirmed vacatur. The permit was illegal, so DAPL technically became a squatter on federal land. 2. But it reversed the shutdown order. The district court hadn't properly applied the Allied Signal test for injunctive relief. Under Allied Signal, courts weigh the seriousness of the agency's error against the disruptive consequences of an interim shutdown. Energy Transfer won on the economics. Shutting down DAPL would cause billions in losses, flood the rail system with oil trains, and hammer North Dakota's economy. Those disruptions were big enough to let the pipeline keep operating while NEPA was redone. The Dakota Access fight showed that even when a pipeline's permit is ruled invalid, courts don't automatically shut it down. The appeals court agreed that the government messed up the permitting process, but it said the lower court went too far by ordering the pipeline to stop operating. When judges weighed the real-world damage of a shutdown, billions in losses, oil moving onto trains, and economic harm to an entire region, they decided those consequences were worse than letting the pipeline keep running while the paperwork was fixed. The takeaway is that once a pipeline is operating and economically important, courts become much more reluctant to turn it off, even if there are legal flaws in how it was approved. Sable's DAPL-style play. This is exactly what Sable is positioning for. Step 1. Get oil flowing ASAP. Become an operational incumbent before courts vacate permits. Step 2. If a court later finds PHMSA's interstate designation flawed, argue disruptive consequences. Shutdown would spike California gasoline prices and threaten energy security. CEO Jim Flores is already building this case, framing SYU production as vital to avoiding fuel shortages in California. Through public statements, regulatory filings, and discussions with federal agencies, Flores has emphasized that restarting the Santa Ynez unit would help stabilize fuel supply and pricing in California and reduce dependence on imported oil. That narrative is meant to matter in court. If judges are asked to weigh a technical permitting flaw against the real-world consequences of shutting down an operating pipeline, higher gasoline prices, supply disruptions, and broader energy risk, Sable wants the balance to tilt toward keeping the oil flowing while any legal issues are sorted out. In plain terms, Sable is trying to follow the same playbook that worked for Dakota Access. The goal is to get oil flowing as quickly as possible so the pipeline becomes part of the real, functioning energy system, not just a proposed project. Once a pipeline is operating, courts are much more reluctant to shut it down, even if they later find problems with the permitting. Keystone XL, the bear case cautionary tale. KXL shows the limits of federal power when states control siting and routing. The federal versus state divide pipeline regulation splits authority. PHMSA, federal, handles safety, construction standards, testing, etc. For cross-border like KXL, the State Department/President handles border crossings. States, via public utility commissions, control siting, routing, and land use. Nebraska's block wall headlines focused on presidential permits. Obama denied, Trump approved, Biden revoked. The real ground-level stall came from the Nebraska Public Service Commission. Opponents argued federal approval didn't override state routing authority. And without a federal eminent domain law for oil pipelines, unlike gas under the Natural Gas Act, TransCanada had to follow state rules. Courts rejected federal preemption claims. In simple terms, Keystone XL shows that federal approval doesn't always win if states control the ground. Even though presidents went back and forth approving and canceling the project, the real roadblock was Nebraska, which had the power to decide where the pipeline could be built. Because oil pipelines don't have the same federal eminent domain rights as gas pipelines, the company still had to follow state siting and routing rules. Courts agreed with the state, and once that happened, federal approval alone wasn't enough to force the project through. Sable's parallel risk. The California Coastal Act. Sable argues the Federal Pipeline Safety Act preempts the state's Coastal Act on restart issues. But the Coastal Commission counters with the Federal Coastal Zone Management Act, which lets states review projects for consistency with coastal plans. If the Ninth Circuit follows KXL logic, PHMSA can approve safety, but the state can still block on land use or spill risk grounds. Result: a federally safe pipeline that can't legally operate without state siting approval. Classic KXL outcome. Sable may win on safety but still lose on permission. Even if federal regulators say the pipeline is safe to operate, California can argue it still has the right to block it under coastal land use and spill risk rules. If courts agree, Sable could end up with a pipeline that's federally approved but legally unable to run without state sign-off. The same trap that ultimately stopped Keystone XL. Colonial Pipeline. The energy security leverage play. This isn't about construction, it's about operational criticality. The 2021 ransomware attack gives hard data on disruption shocks, which Sable is using as its main lobbying weapon. The 2021 Crisis Darkside ransomware forced Colonial to shut its 5,500-mile system, cutting fuel to the East Coast. Panic buying emptied stations across the Southeast. Prices spiked, flights rerouted over jet fuel shortages. The government reacted fast. Biden waived Jones Act rules for foreign tankers and relaxed EPA fuel specs. It proved that in real energy crises, rules bend. The Colonial Pipeline hack showed what happens when a major fuel artery suddenly stops. Gas stations ran dry, prices jumped, and airlines had to adjust flights because fuel wasn't available. Faced with immediate disruption, the government quickly relaxed shipping and fuel rules that normally take years to change. The lesson is that when energy supply is threatened, regulations that seem rigid on paper can bend very quickly in practice. Sable's Energy Island framing. Sable is trying to reframe the fight away from environmental permitting and toward energy security. By calling California an energy island, Jim Flores is arguing that the state is unusually vulnerable because it's largely cut off from national pipeline networks and depends heavily on imported oil and fuel. That makes any disruption, whether from regulation, litigation, or infrastructure shutdowns, far more damaging than in states that can easily pull supply from elsewhere. The December 2025 National Energy Emergency Declaration is meant to reinforce that framing. Sable's goal is to put its pipelines in the same mental category as the Colonial Pipeline during the ransomware attack. Not just an industrial asset, but critical infrastructure. If courts accept that blocking the Santa Ynez pipelines meaningfully threatens fuel availability, price stability, or broader economic security in California, they may be more willing to allow operations to continue while legal disputes are resolved. In effect, Sable is betting that once the issue is seen as keeping the lights on rather than approving a permit, judges and regulators will prioritize continuity of supply over procedural objections. Trans Mountain Expansion (TMX). The unquantifiable risk exit TMX in Canada shows when political risk becomes uninsurable for big players. Kinder Morgan's capitulation in 2018, Kinder Morgan stopped spending on TMX amid deadlock between anti-pipeline British Columbia and pro-pipeline Alberta. They called it unquantifiable risk. No engineering or capital could fix the politics, and forced the Canadian government to buy it for Canadian $4.5 billion, nationalizing the headache. The ExxonMobil parallel Exxon's sale of SYU to Sable mirrors this. After the 2015 spill, Exxon faced the same unquantifiable risk in Santa Barbara. County refused trucking permits and repairs, so they wrote down $2.5 billion and exited. Sable bought at distressed prices because Exxon needed a political escape. Unlike majors, Sable, as a single-asset private player, can stomach that risk. It doesn't need broad social license, just a legal one. Exxon walked away because the risk stopped being about oil and started being about politics. After the 2015 spill, Exxon couldn't find a reliable way to move. Oil trucking was blocked, pipeline repairs were stalled, and every step invited lawsuits. As a global company, Exxon couldn't tolerate an open-ended fight in Santa Barbara, so it wrote down roughly $2.5 billion and exited. Sable stepped in because it doesn't have the same constraints. It's a single-asset operator that can take on political and legal risk. Where Exxon needed broad public acceptance to operate, Sable only needs a narrow legal path to get oil flowing. At its core, the Sable Offshore thesis isn't a traditional energy play. It's a high-leverage bet on a specific legal outcome. It blends MVP's legislative override ambition, but via weaker executive tools. DAPL's operational squatting strategy, get flowing fast, then defend with disruptive consequences arguments. Colonial's energy security narrative as PR and legal cover. KXL's structural risk, courts could separate safety from siting, letting state blocks stand. At its core, the Sable Offshore thesis is not a traditional energy investment, but a highly leveraged bet on legal and regulatory outcomes. It combines elements of several past pipeline battles: the ambition of Mountain Valley to break gridlock through federal authority, albeit using weaker executive tools rather than legislation; the Dakota Access strategy of getting oil flowing quickly to gain the protections that come with being an operating asset; the Colonial Pipeline lesson that energy security concerns can bend rules and reshape enforcement; and the Keystone XL risk that courts may uphold state control over siting even if federal safety approval is secured. The payoff depends on whether these forces align in Sable's favor, or whether the structural limits exposed by Keystone ultimately prevail. Veneco. The scorched earth precedent if Mountain Valley Pipeline is the dream scenario for Sable federal intervention smashing through gridlock, Veneco is the nightmare scenario that keeps investors up at night. Veneco is the direct historical control group. It was the other operator hammered by the exact same 2015 Refugio oil spill, dealing with the same local regulators, same Santa Barbara County environment, and same transportation choke points. Veneco operated Platform Holly, in state waters about 1.52 miles offshore Goleta, and the Elwood Onshore Facility, EOF. Like Sable's Santa Ynez unit, Veneco relied on the Plains All-American Pipeline System, lines 901 or 903, to move oil to market. When the pipeline ruptured in May 2015, Veneco's revenue dropped to zero overnight. For nearly 2 years, they tried to get temporary trucking permits to haul oil to refineries as a bridge solution. The blockade came from the city of Goleta and the California State Lands Commission delays and denials that bled the company dry financially. The quitclaim exit, April 2017. After burning cash and hitting a wall on permits, Veneco pulled a scorched earth move that Sable must avoid. On April 17, 2017, Veneco filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy and simultaneously executed a quitclaim deed, surrendering its leases for the South Elwood field, including Platform Holly and related onshore-nearshore assets, back to the State Lands Commission. They essentially dropped the keys on the desk and walked away, leaving the state to handle decommissioning. The legal aftermath. The failed takings claim Veneco's liquidating trust later sued the state of California and the State Lands Commission for inverse condemnation, a regulatory taking, seeking around $161 million in compensation. The argument: by denying trucking permits, forcing abandonment, and then occupying/taking over the Elwood onshore facility for decommissioning to manage lethal H2S gas risks, the state had effectively taken private property for public use without just compensation. The ruling, Bankruptcy Court 2022. The court sided with the state. It found that Veneco had created an emergency by threatening to leave the facility unmanned, requiring constant monitoring for public safety and environmental protection. The commission's takeover was an exercise of police power to avert imminent harm, not a compensable taking. Outcome: Veneco investors and creditors got nothing from the claim. The state seized control of the assets, is managing decommissioning at significant taxpayer expense, and effectively killed commercial production there, leaving oil in the ground. In plain English, Veneco ran out of options and chose to walk away completely. After years of burning cash and being blocked from trucking oil, Veneco filed for bankruptcy in April 2017 and literally handed its offshore and onshore assets back to the state of California, leaving the state responsible for shutting them down and cleaning them up. Veneco later argued that the state had effectively taken its property by denying permits and then stepping in to control the facilities, and it sued for compensation. The court rejected that claim, ruling that the state acted to prevent an immediate public safety and environmental risk, not to seize property for profit. The outcome of this was that Veneco investors and creditors recovered nothing. The state took control of the assets, decommissioning moved forward at taxpayer expense, and commercial production in the area was permanently shut down with oil left in the ground. Relevance to Sable. The takings warning: Sable is now threatening a similar inverse condemnation lawsuit, valued at $347 million plus, against Santa Barbara County if local permits are denied outright. The risk. Veneco shows California courts are very willing to frame aggressive regulatory blocks, especially around safety, spill prevention, and H2S hazards, as legitimate police power exercises rather than takings. The key distinction: Veneco's platforms were in state waters, fully under State Lands Commission jurisdiction, while Sable's Santa Ynez unit is in federal waters, Oxash/Bowen jurisdiction. This gives Sable a stronger federal preemption argument overall. However, the onshore Las Flores Canyon processing facility remains vulnerable, the exact same kind of choke point where Veneco's history could repeat if state-local agencies dig in on siting, safety, or environmental grounds. Veneco is the cautionary tale of what happens when you can't get operational momentum, or federal override total capitulation, bankruptcy, and zero recovery on takings claims. Sable's path depends on avoiding that abandonment trap by restarting under federal authority before state forces can force a similar surrender. This is Avi. Like and subscribe. On to the next.